gender roles and traditional heterosexual relationships. You know, they all spoke about how they were the main sort of person doing the domestic work in their family. They did the majority of childcare, and quite a few times they sort of spoke about, you know, the proper role of a mother and a woman. This was fascinating for me because it really jars with what we hear, particularly in academia. What we hear is that marriage is in decline, heterosexual marriage is in decline, heterosexual people don't want to get married anymore, women are rejecting kind of the domestic sphere and childcare and domestic labour, and you know, are becoming more sort of financially and perhaps emotionally kind of independent. And that's certainly something that we see as a dominant discourse in academia, particularly when you've worked in academia for as long as I have. You know, you really get this permeating sense of that. Yet these women's experiences is really, really different from that. They're absolutely emphasising these kind of traditional roles that in another world, what I would argue potentially a very white middle class educated world, are actually seen as really quite negative things. But these women were embracing them as really very positive aspects. And I think that's really interesting. I think that really does kind of tell us a lot about the way in which the shifts away, or not, from traditional gender roles and traditional heterosexual relationships are being enacted in very different ways in very different populations, which often I don't think literature takes account of. We're told that marriage is in decline. We're told that heterosexual people aren't getting married as often anymore. And that's kind of taken as a statement of fact. And what I don't think we get is the sort of nuances and the intricacies of that. Well, who is it that isn't getting married? Why aren't they getting married? And for those people that are getting married, how is that being performed and why is that being done? And so I think it raises very interesting questions about kind of the differences in experience around these kind of big social institutions, marriage, relationships, gender roles, etc. So what I want to finish off by saying really is coming back to this notion of harder to reach. And I put it in inverted commas because it's incredibly difficult. I think we need to change the way we talk about this. I don't think it's about populations being harder to reach. I think it's about populations being difficult to engage. And I think the responsibility for that lies in absolutely no small part to the researchers. I don't think this is about people existing over there, that we just can't quite reach them. We as researchers need to move ourselves to these people, right? And engage them on a level, in spaces, in ways that they understand and that they make sense of. With this being a gender conference, I also got thinking about gender and harder to reach groups. And actually what we see is that when we talk about harder to reach groups, very often the work to reach a harder to reach group is disproportionately placed on women's shoulders, even when the harder to reach group is men, and men as a big general population are seen as harder to reach because they don't go to the doctors, they don't go to the doctors early enough, etc. So even when men are the hardest to reach population, it's the wives and the girlfriends, even the mothers, where the responsibility is put to kind of reach these men. Or otherwise, I mean, there's another project that's going on in Glasgow where they were trying to reach men, overweight men, to try and get them to kind of lose weight and engage in this programme. And that was done through the local football club. And they would kind of go out for a healthy curry, and they were sort of engaged in all these activities, but very much kind of male activities, very kind of masculine world, which I think is really interesting in kind of reinforcing this idea that men are like this and women are like this. And actually, if we want to break down this notion of harder to reach and make people easy to reach, I'm just worried that reinforcing these kind of traditional ideas about what men and women are, and indeed, you know, that this could go further and say what, you know, different races and different cultures and different age groups are like. I don't really think it's a sophisticated way of doing it. I think it's very short-termist, and I think that what Cancer Research UK are doing is really, really positive in engaging with research and engaging with researchers who have the kind of vocabulary and the skills to kind of challenge these quite static sort of notions of harder to reach populations. So I'm really enthusiastic about obviously the project, but also about the kind of funding stream and the framework within which this is being done. but I would always encourage you to take apart this notion of harder to reach whenever you see it. Any questions?
I've got a question. If no one else, yeah. What kind of work did the mothers do? When they said, was it sort of, did it fit into kind of traditional sort of gender?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point, actually. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yes, it really did. So we've got 7 women in the North East. Have a think. I remember that one of them is a administrator for a large type of company. I can't remember what the company is, but she's the administrator. And I think actually it's very male-dominated. I don't know if it's like a building company or something, but I think it's a very male-dominated work environment, but she's, of course, the administrator. Then I think most of the other women work in kind of service roles, so I'll sort of work in shops and things like that. So yeah, I think generally what we would recognise as very female work, if you like. And also what's important to add on that point is that women's work was very much fitting around their family, very much fitting around their children, whereas, again, coming back to this notion that it's different for the dads, theirs wasn't. So one of our women in the North East, her partner works over in somewhere over by the coast, about 30 miles away, and he works away all week and then just comes home at weekends. And that's really interesting because I can't imagine any of the women would do that, you know, but the dad, that's sort of perfectly fine, you know, for him to do. The women's work practices very much fit in with family life.
And do they all work part-time?
Yes.
And how does the childcare, how does it work sometimes?
So mostly the childcare is done by friends and family, generally by female friends and family members. As I said, for a lot of them, they are the first ones in their group to be having children, so actually their friends are really enthusiastic about kind of looking after their kids, you know, whenever they can. I don't think any of them have sort of formal childcare, as it were. I think it's all sort of done very informal arrangements.
Yeah. As you said at the start, you're looking for kind of as many people as you can to keep getting involved in the research and stuff. With 21 people that you do have at the moment, do you kind of feel that they're representative of teenage mothers, or are you sort of looking for other types of teenage mothers to get involved?
Yeah, well, first of all, we don't have 21, right, sadly. That's what we were aiming for. That was our adjusted aim, but we're not quite there yet. That's a really good point, actually, because there is a risk in this that what we're doing is homogenising this group of teenage mums and saying that all teenage mums are the same and are having the same experience. I think in Bristol, they've got a really good sort of cross-section, really sort of fairly representative group of the wider population of teenage mums. They come from a variety of ethnic backgrounds, of classes, of areas of the city. What we found in the North East is that we have actually quite a lot of what we might recognise as sort of upper working class women, if not middle class teenage mums, in the sense that, you know, they're still living with their parents, but the parents' houses are big enough that they can live there with their partner and with their child. So for the North East end, I don't think we've got a really representative sample. No, not of the whole population of teenage mums. We are working with a children's centre in Middlesbrough, Park End in Middlesbrough, which is much more kind of representative, and it's much more, I guess, of the kind of stereotypical sort of, you know, teenage mother population, which is great. And actually they're having a very different experience of teenage motherhood from the women that we're getting from Ingleby Barwick, who are a lot more sort of middle class and actually a lot more normative in the way they are doing motherhood. What we don't have actually is anyone from any ethnic minority groups in the North East or in Belfast. That's of course due to the sort of population in these areas anyway. Bristol do have a few minority ethnic participants, but we don't in the North East, and that's quite... It's not problematic in terms of the findings of the research, but I guess if we wanted to kind of roll that out onto a bigger scale, you know, we need more sort of representative findings. This is very much a pilot project, and Cancer Research UK are fully aware that it's a pilot project and that actually there are these kind of sampling and sort of population issues, really. I guess the thing is that, you know, when you're talking about a group which is harder to reach and harder to engage, those that are the least engaged in health behaviours and kind of, you know, local policy and all that type of stuff, they're not going to engage in research either, you know, so there's always a risk that you're losing that kind of sample of the population, which actually are probably the people that would benefit the most from what we're trying to do in the research. Again, I think if we had longer and more money, I think we could address that, but that's kind of the nature of research. Never enough time, never enough money. Thanks.
Could you say a little bit about when you were getting them to take pictures, and you said that they shouldn't take selfies and they shouldn't take stage pictures. Why you thought that would be the case?
Well, what we did, yeah, we had huge amounts of problems with the pictures, right? And we debated really long and hard about what to do with the pictures, whether to give them disposable cameras or whether to get them to take it on their phone or whether to sort of give them a digital camera, etc. What we found is that there are some kind of normative behaviours that exist around taking a picture. When somebody says, I'm going to take a picture of you, you know what to do, kind of instinctively you know how to move and how to look and how to pose and things like that. And what we didn't want to do was kind of get pictures where those things were happening. We wanted to capture moments sort of in everyday life, you know, and everyday life is messy and it's not posed and it's not staged and there aren't sort of normative conventions sort of around it, you know, things happen spontaneously. And that's kind of what we wanted to get them to do, was to just take pictures spontaneously and go, oh, that's what I do quite a lot, a picture of that, you know. That's why we got them to take disposable cameras, so that it was something which was a little bit out of the ordinary, so they wouldn't just you know, take a picture on their phone with a particular filter with the mind to putting it on Instagram, but that they would actually be taking pictures which they'd kind of thought about, thought, yeah, this represents me and my life. What we had the problem with was that disposable cameras are actually rubbish. So when we got the first set of pictures back, they were just really dark and you couldn't actually see anything, and we couldn't really do that much with them. So then what we said was, go away and take pictures with your phone, but these are the kind of rules, if you like. By that time we'd built up a really good rapport with them and they kind of got where we were coming from, you know. And they went away and took pictures with their phones, which were actually much better quality, much more kind of like what we were after. The reason we gave them disposables in the first place was that actually we didn't want to assume that they had access to a phone and that they would have the phone throughout the duration of the project. We kind of assumed they would, but we didn't want to sort of put that assumption onto them. You know, we didn't know what sort of populations we were recruiting from and levels of poverty and things like that. It turns out they all have phones, of course, so that wasn't really a problem. But I think the disposable cameras actually did have a really good role in getting them to sort of think about the pictures that they were taking. So even if we didn't end up using the pictures from them, the kind of process of learning through them, I think was really useful, actually. Does that answer your question? Yeah. I'm not sure. Yeah. Great.
My cousin is sort of like a young mum, and she, what I found interesting was when you were talking about the pulling away and pose, is that her relationship with her sort of equivalent of mother-in-law is that they have completely like cut her out, yet they accept their son. I know it's partly just because they're, you know, it's their son and they can't really ever get rid of him, but they accept the child and their son, but not her, because they see it completely as all her fault kind of thing.
Wow.
I was just wondering whether that was like a, I don't know, not a universal thing, but whether this sort of like woman blaming thing is like a common thing or not.
I think that's really interesting, actually, and I think it is actually in a lot of instances, not necessarily with close friends and family, but I think, although it is in some instances, but when the women were talking about sort of feeling judged and feeling that they couldn't go to particular places, or that particularly on Facebook, you know, when they were uploading pictures to Facebook, that they were getting some negative comments and negative reactions. What they talked about a lot was the fact that it was women that were actually making these really negative comments, and they felt most judged by other women. I think that's interesting. I think there's a kind of class and culture dynamics to that, actually, and I wouldn't want to kind of assume what's going on there, because of course, you know, we're not sort of doing the work with the people that are doing the judging, right? But I think it's something about how motherhood in general is judged. Actually, I think all women, no matter what age you have children, you're always judged on the way that you're performing that motherhood. Even if you are doing it right, you know, how you're expected to do it. Society doesn't value motherhood. That's why, you know, there's debates around maternity pay. That's why women's careers stall after they've had children, because I think the work that goes into motherhood, I don't think is valued, because it doesn't have a financial aspect to it. Well, it does, but it's not sort of economically as, you know, productive in the way that we understand kind of capitalist industrial relations, and therefore I think it's undervalued. And I think that even women that are kind of doing it properly, if you like, feel undervalued. And I think very often that gets projected as a judgment of others. Okay, so I might be doing it properly, but I still feel judged, but they're doing it less properly, so I'm going to judge them for it, you know. And I think sometimes it can be a defensive, kind of reactive issue, really, that even women who are doing it within normative frameworks sort of feel. But I do think it's interesting that this kind of the judgment from other women, and particularly when we talk about gendered spaces, the fact that the teenage mums were feeling that they didn't want to go to certain soft play, they didn't want to go to certain playgrounds, etc. Even though they were what we might understand as kind of safe female spaces, actually for these women they weren't safe female spaces. There was a really interesting politics going on in these spaces, even though they were sort of women only, you know, informally women only spaces. You know, does that make sense?
You briefly mentioned the kind of the type of shouting back that some women had to criticisms that they've made or pressures they experience, which like you interestingly framed within a kind of breaking down of gender barriers between like communication and assertiveness and stuff. And I was just wondering whether there was any kind of further detail within the study as it is at this point now, as to whether gendered social conventions were reinforced or at all like broken down as the result of this new this new frontier of what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a mother in that community or society that they found themselves in.
So, okay, so I think there's a kind of simultaneous thing happening here, right? I think on the one hand, women are, the women that we've spoken to are kind of resisting this notion of proper femininity and sort of, you know, proper performance of womanhood by shouting back and by telling people to shut the fuck up and by sort of, you know, ignoring people's perspectives. And I think that's a very active thing that's kind of going on. But then at the same time, I think they're also drawing on these kind of very traditional conventions of womanhood by emphasising the fact that they're getting married, you know, they're in a long-term heterosexual partnership, you know, they're not relying on benefits and things like that, you know. And in fact, a couple of them did speak about how their partners were providing for them, you know, which is incredibly sort of, you know, normative and sort of, you know, standard sort of practice, if you like. So it's interesting that there's kind of both of those things going on at the same time. So what it seems is that this kind of active rejection of gender roles, you know, this kind of, you know, telling people to shut up and things like that, is happening, but within an overall framework of sort of a traditional gender role. So that stuff is happening on a kind of day-to-day basis, but going on in the background is a kind of embracing of these broad sort of traditional gender conventions. And I'm not sure of the relationship between those two things. I don't think these women think in terms of gender, to be honest. I really don't. I think we as academics and as feminists are heightened to it. I think everything I do, I think, is because of my gender, you know, and I always think in gender terms because I've been trained to do that, you know. I don't think these women do. I don't think that, you know, when they do something, when they say something to someone, or when they talk about, oh, we're getting married soon, he's my long-term partner, etc., things like that, I don't think they frame that within a notion of traditional gender conventions at all. I think that's just normal. I think that's just normal accepted practice, that happens, that they exist in this kind of very traditional gendered world. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure how. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, we're going to have to stop there, so thank you very much.
Thank you.